She was a widow with a debt she never asked for, a horse that knew the trail by heart, and a mail route that could cost her life. He was a broken doctor hiding at the end of the line, a man haunted by war, grief, and one unforgivable secret. When Abby Vance and Nathaniel Reed are brought together by storms, lost letters, and danger, neither of them expects love. But in the wild Wyoming frontier, where every mile can reveal a betrayal and every silence can hide a wound, the hardest battle is not against the weather, it is learning to trust again.
March in Wyoming territory. It is spring, it's just winter with a meaner attitude. Abby Vance blew into her cupped hands, her breath plumed white in the dark, drafty barn. 5 in the morning. The cold was the kind that settled deep in your bones and refused to leave. She grabbed the heavy leather saddle and swung it over Copper's back. The big roan gelding shifted his weight. He didn't like the cold any more than she did. "Easy, boy," she murmured. Her voice was scratchy. Sleep still hung in her throat. She pulled it cinched tight, 67 miles ahead. 22 stops. Route 14. The government called it a star route. Most folks just called it a lifeline. Abby mounted up. The mail bags were heavy today. Good. Heavy meant people out here weren't completely forgotten. The wind howled through the wooden slats of the barn. You could smell the storm brewing. That sharp, metallic scent of snow on the way. She nudged Copper forward, out into the dark. By noon, the sky was the color of bruised iron. The wind was whipping the snow sideways. It stung her cheeks like flying sand. She pulled her wool scarf up over her nose and kept her head down. Copper trudged on. Stop after stop. She shoved letters into wooden boxes. Fixed a rusty latch the wind had torn loose. Her fingers were going completely numb inside her thick leather gloves. Stop 14, the old Miller place. Martha Miller was waiting out on her porch, wrapped tight in a faded quilt. She was practically blind in one eye, and the other wasn't doing much better. Abby pulled up to the steps. She dug into her pouch and handed down a single, slightly damp envelope. "From your sister back in Ohio, Martha," Abby called out over the wind. Martha clutched it to her chest. Her hands were shaking, and it wasn't just from the cold. "Abby, I can't make out the letters. My eyes, they're just no good in this light. Would you mind?" Abby didn't hesitate. She swung down from the saddle. Her heavy boots crunched in the fresh snow. She took the letter back, tore the seal open, and read it aloud right there on the porch. The sister was doing well. The new baby was walking. Good news. Simple news. Martha wiped a tear from her cheek. "You're freezing, child. You shouldn't have stayed out here to read this to an old woman. Not in a storm like this. The government just pays you to drop the mail, not to freeze to death reading it." Abby looked right at the older woman. She spoke loud enough to cut straight through the howling wind, her voice steady and clear. "The government pays for the delivery, Martha, but human decency is free. It doesn't stop just because the temperature drops. If we only look out for each other when the weather is fair, then we aren't much of a community at all. Kindness isn't a fair weather chore. We all have a duty to treat each other with dignity, storm or no storm." Martha nodded slowly. A small, warm smile cracked her weathered face. "You be safe out there, Abigail." Abby climbed back up on Copper. The storm was getting worse. The snow was falling thick and fast now. Whiteout conditions were coming. She had 8 stops left. Hours passed. The final stop. The end of the line. The old Reed property sat pushed up tight against the foothills. It was late afternoon, but the sky was pitch black. The cold was a physical weight, pushing down on her shoulders. She rode up to the small, dark cabin. There was no wooden box on a post here, just a front porch covered in a foot of fresh. She pulled the last bundle of letters from the leather sack. Her back ached. Her jaw was clamped so tight, her teeth hurt. She stepped onto the porch, raised a heavy fist, knocked twice on the solid oak door. A long silence followed, just the sound of the howling wind. Then, the sharp metallic slide of an iron bolt. The door cracked open, just a few inches. A sliver of warm, yellow lamplight spilled out onto the snow at her boots. A man's hand reached out through the narrow gap, long fingers, a jagged, ugly scar running straight across the back of the knuckles. Abby placed the mail into his open palm. The fingers closed tight around the letters. The hand pulled back into the shadows. The door shut with a heavy thud. The bolt slid firmly into place. No hello, no thank you, just a closed door. Abby stood there for a second. The wind pulled hard at her heavy coat. She turned around and walked back to her horse. She patted his snow-covered neck. "Job's done, boy," she whispered. "Let's go home." She swung up into the saddle, turned her back to the locked cabin, and rode straight back into the teeth of the storm. The cabin was dead quiet, the kind of quiet that makes your ears ring. Abby sat at the scarred oak table. A single kerosene lamp pushed back the shadows. Its yellow light flickered over a piece of paper. The paper was folded right down the middle, creased tight. It was a banknote, $340, plus 8% interest. Samuel had signed it, her husband, the man she buried 3 years ago. He signed it, took the money, and never said a word. He used her land as collateral. The land her father cleared, the land her mother died on. Samuel bet it all, and he lost. Abby ran a callous thumb over his signature. The ink was faded. Her anger wasn't. She remembered the day she found the paper. Samuel was barely cold in the ground. She was looking for the deed to the wagon. She found this instead. A ticking clock. A promise that the bank would come and take the only thing she had left. That was why she rode. Not for the glory, not for the love of the open trail. She rode for pennies a mile. Because a woman alone in Colton County didn't have many ways to make hard cash. She folded the paper, put it back in the tin box, locked it. The next morning, the town of Colton was knee-deep in gray slush. Abby tied copper to the hitching post outside Higgins' General Store. The wind had a nasty bite to it. She pulled her collar up and pushed through the heavy wooden doors. The store smelled like roasted coffee beans and oiled leather and stale tobacco. The iron stove in the center of the room was glowing dull red. 2 men stood next to it, warming their hands. Deputy Amos Boone and Josiah Blackwood. Boone was a man who wore his badge like a threat. Blackwood was worse. He wore a tailored suit in a cattle town. He owned half the valley, and he wanted the other half. Abby walked past them. Head down. She went straight to the counter to pick up a sack of oats. "Well now," Blackwood said. His voice was smooth, like snake oil. "If it isn't the pride of the Postal Service, tell me, Mrs. Vance, how long do you plan to keep up this little charade?" Abby stopped. She didn't turn around. "Not right away," Boone chuckled. "A wet, ugly sound, Abby. It's a man's job, Abby. Out there in the snow, it ain't right. A woman riding that far alone, it ain't natural." Abby turned slowly. She looked at Boone, then she looked at Blackwood. She didn't blink. She didn't smile. "Natural," Abby said. The word tasted bitter. She walked closer to the stove. The men actually stepped back a half inch. "Let me tell you men something about what is right and what is natural," Abby said. Her voice carried through the quiet store. "The federal government granted the women of Wyoming the right to vote back in 1869. That wasn't a mistake, and it wasn't a favor. It was a recognition of a simple fact. A contract does not care if the person signing it wears a wool skirt or a pair of denim trousers. It only cares if the job gets done, if the mail gets delivered. Blackwood's smile faltered. Just a little. Abby didn't stop. She pointed a gloved finger right at Blackwood's expensive chest. You both stand here talking about what a woman should or shouldn't do. But human rights start with a person taking responsibility for their own survival. True equality isn't just about marking a ballot. It is about the absolute right to earn a living, to pay off debts, to own property without asking a man for permission. I am out there on that trail because I have the right to determine my own fate, just like you do. Denying a woman the right to work the same soil or ride the same trail as a man isn't just foolish. It's a violation of basic human dignity, and I won't have it. The store was dead silent. Even old man Higgins behind the counter had stopped breathing. Abby picked up her sack of oats. She hoisted it onto her shoulder. I'll be seeing you, gentlemen, she said. She walked out. The door slammed behind her. The cold air hit her face. It felt good. It felt like freedom. She tied the oats to the saddle, climbed up. The trail was waiting, and she had a debt to pay. April in Wyoming is a liar. It gives you a few days of sunshine. The snow melts a little. You see the brown grass, you think the worst is over. Then it hits you from behind. The blizzard rolled in fast. 1 minute, the sky was pale blue. The next, it was a solid wall of angry white. Abby was halfway through the route. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in 10 minutes. Copper fought the bit. He wanted to turn around. He wanted the barn. No, Abby shouted over the wind. Keep moving. She couldn't turn back. She had a package in the canvas bag, wrapped tight in oilcloth. It was medicine. For the Miller place. Little Sarah Miller had a fever that wouldn't break. The medicine had come in on the morning train. If Abby didn't deliver it, the child might not make it through the week. So she rode. The wind shrieked. It sounded like a dying animal. The snow was so thick she couldn't see past Copper's ears. Every breath burned her lungs. Her fingers were stiff blocks of ice. She passed the Miller place, dropped the medicine box into the father's waiting hands. He cried. Abby didn't stay. She couldn't. If she stopped moving, she would freeze solid. 4 stops left, then 3, then 2. It was dark by the time she reached the end of the line, the Reed property. She could barely sit upright. Her vision was blurring at the edges. Copper's head was hanging low. He was done, and so was she. She pulled the horse up to the dark cabin. She fumbled with the mail pouch. Her hands wouldn't work. They were just useless, frozen claws. Before she could raise a hand to knock, the heavy oak door swung open. Not a crack, wide open. A man stood there, the same man from before. Tall, broad shoulders, graying hair. But this time, she could see his face. It was a hard face, lined with things he had seen and wanted to forget. He didn't reach for the mail. He looked at her, really looked at her. He saw the ice in her eyelashes. He saw the way she was swaying in the saddle. Barn, he said. His voice was deep, rough, like stones grinding together. Put the horse in. Now. He stepped back. He didn't come out into the snow. He didn't grab the reins. He just pointed to the heavy wooden barn doors 50 yards away. Abby nodded. It was a jerky, stiff motion. She rode Copper into the barn. It was dark, but it was out of the wind. She slid off the saddle. Her legs gave out. She hit the dirt floor, hard. She laid there for a second, just trying to breathe. Then she heard footsteps, slow and steady. The man walked into the barn. He held a lantern. He set it down on a barrel. He walked over to Copper and started unbuckling the frozen saddle girth. Abby pushed herself up. She leaned against a stall door. She was shivering so hard her teeth rattled. The man threw the saddle over a rail. He threw a heavy blanket over the horse. Then he turned to Abby. He didn't step closer. He kept his distance. There's a fire inside, he said. Coffee, you can come in or you can freeze out here. Abby looked at him. She was confused. You aren't going to carry me in. I can barely walk. The man shook his head. He looked her dead in the eye. Listen to me carefully, he said. His voice was steady. I am offering you shelter, but I will not put my hands on you. I will not drag you into my home. True respect means honoring another person's bodily autonomy, even in a crisis. You are a grown woman. You have the right to consent to where you go and who you go with. If I drag you in there, I am taking away your choice. I am treating you like a child or a piece of property. My desire to help you does not override your right to make your own decisions about your own body. So, you make the choice. You walk through that door on your own 2 feet because you decided to. Not because a man forced you to. Abby stared at him. The shivering slowed down just a second. She understood. He wasn't being cruel. He was being deeply, profoundly respectful. He was giving her power when she felt the most powerless. She took a deep breath. Her legs felt like lead, but she pushed off the wood. She stood up straight. All right, Abby said. Her voice was weak, but it didn't shake. I'll come in. The man nodded, just once. I'm Nathaniel, he said. Abby, she replied. He picked up the lantern. He turned and walked out into the swirling snow. He didn't look back to see if she was following. He trusted her to make the walk. Abby pulled her coat tight. She stepped out of the barn. She put one foot in front of the other. Following the lantern light through the dark, the dust in the attic tasted like old regrets. Abby sneezed. She wiped her nose with the back of her wrist. She was looking for a spare saddle blanket. Copper was getting sores from the old one. She opened Samuel's cedar trunk. It sat in the corner, heavy, dark. She hadn't opened it in 2 years, didn't see the point. She dug, past a moth-eaten wool coat, past a pair of cracked leather boots. Her fingers brushed against a small tin box. It rattled. Abby pulled it out. The lid was stiff. She pried it open with her thumbnail. Inside were just scraps, a broken watch chain, a smooth river stone, and a piece of heavy parchment folded tight. She unfolded it. The paper was crisp. The ink was black and precise. It was a medical receipt, dated 1875. St. Louis, Missouri. Patient Samuel Vance. Diagnosis: advanced consumption. Terminal. Attending physician, Dr. Nathaniel Reed. Abby stopped breathing. The attic suddenly felt hot, too small. Nathaniel Reed. She stared at the name. The letters blurred, then sharpened. Nathaniel. The man at the end of her routine. The man who had offered her shelter in the blizzard. The man with the scarred hands. He knew. He knew Samuel was dying. 6 months before Samuel actually passed. 6 months where she could have planned. 6 months where she could have saved money instead of letting Samuel borrow against the land. Samuel knew, and the doctor knew, and they both decided to keep her in the dark. Abby stood up. The tin box clattered to the floor. She didn't pick it up. She climbed down the ladder, grabbed her coat, grabbed her hat. She didn't wait for the mail run. She saddled Copper right then and there. The Wyoming wind was blowing hard. It wasn't snow today. It was dust. Fine, gritty red dust that got in your teeth and stung your eyes. Abby didn't care. She rode hard. The miles ate away beneath Copperette's hooves. She pushed the big roan faster than she should have. Anger was a hot coal in her chest. She reached the end of the line in under 3 hours. The cabin looked the same, quiet, lonely. Abby swung down from the saddle. She didn't hitch the horse. She marched straight up the wooden steps. Her boots hit the porch like hammer strikes. She didn't knock. She pounded. The door opened. Nathaniel stood there. He looked surprised for half a second. Then his eyes dropped to the piece of paper crumpled in her fist. He knew. He saw it in her eyes. St. Louis, Abby said. Her voice shook, not from the cold, from rage. 1875. Nathaniel didn't flinch. He didn't look away. He just nodded slowly. Yes, you knew him. I treated him. Yes. Abby stepped closer. She shoved the paper flat against his chest. You knew he was dying. You knew he had 6 months. And you let him come back here and pretend everything was fine. You let him borrow money against my farm. You let him lie to me. Nathaniel looked down at the paper, then up at her. His face was a mask of old pain. Samuel asked me not to tell, Nathaniel said. His voice was low. He said he wanted to protect you. He said you had enough worries with the farm. He begged me to keep it a secret between men. Abby laughed. It was a harsh, ugly sound. Protect me? She took a step back. You didn't protect me. You blindsided me. Nathaniel stepped out onto the porch. The wind whipped his graying hair. He didn't try to defend himself. He looked her straight in the eyes, his expression heavy with a hard-earned truth. You are right, Nathaniel said, his voice cutting clearly through the howling wind. I was wrong. As a doctor, my job was to treat the disease. But as a man, I made a terrible mistake when I agreed to hide the truth from you. No one has the right to strip a wife of her right to know and her right to prepare, all in the name of protection. A marriage is a partnership, not a dictatorship. Withholding the truth about life and death is a violation of your right to consent to your own future. Every person has the absolute right to self-determination. By keeping Samuel a secret, I robbed you of the chance to make decisions about your own life, your own finances, and your own grief. I stole your agency. And for that, Abigail, I owe you a profound apology. I am truly sorry. Abby stood there. The wind battered them both. She expected him to make excuses, to say he was bound by medical oaths, to say it wasn't his place. But he didn't. He owned it. He spoke the exact truth that had been burning in her chest. The anger didn't vanish, but the fire went out of it. It left behind an exhausted ache. She looked at his hands, the scarred knuckles. He was a man who had made life and death choices before, and he knew the weight of getting it wrong. An apology doesn't pay the bank, Nathaniel, she said quietly. No, he agreed. It doesn't. But it is the truth, and you are owed the truth. Abby nodded slowly. She folded the paper, put it in her pocket. She turned around, walked down the steps, climbed onto Copper. She didn't say goodbye, and he didn't ask her to stay. 2 weeks passed. The weather softened. The snow melted off the lower ridges. The trail turned from hard ice to thick, sucking mud. Abby kept riding. She delivered the mail. She saw Nathaniel every 3 days. They didn't talk much, a nod, a quick exchange of weather predictions. The anger was gone, replaced by a strange, quiet understanding. They were 2 people carrying heavy ghosts. It was a Tuesday morning. Abby was at the Colton post office, sorting her bags. Lucy Carter, the young clerk, came out from the back room. She was holding a single envelope. She looked confused. Mrs. Vance? Lucy said. I found this at the bottom of a canvas sack from Denver. It must have been stuck in the lining for God knows how long. Abby took the envelope. It was thick with dust. The edges were yellowed and curled. She wiped the dirt off the front. The postage mark was faint. St. Louis, September 1875, almost 3 years ago. The handwriting was elegant, slanted, a woman's hand. It was addressed to Nathaniel Reed. Return address, E. Reed, Eleanor, his late wife. Abby's stomach tightened. She held a voice from the grave in her hand. She packed carefully into her leather pouch, wrapped it in an extra piece of oilcloth. The ride out to the end of the line felt longer than usual. The mud slowed Copper down, but Abby's mind was racing faster than a spooked herd. When she finally pulled up to the cabin, the afternoon sun was hanging low, casting long, dark shadows across the valley. Nathaniel was chopping wood beside the porch. The axe rose and fell in a steady, punishing rhythm. Thwack, split, toss. He stopped when he heard copper. He wiped his brow with his forearm. Set the axe down. Abby dismounted. She didn't pull the regular bundle of mail. She reached into her pocket. She pulled out the single oilcloth-wrapped envelope. She walked up to him. She didn't hand it over right away. "Nathaniel," she said softly, "the clerk in town found something. It was lost in the Denver sorting office. For 3 years." She handed it to him. Nathaniel looked at the envelope. His hands were covered in sawdust. He wiped them on his trousers, slowly, deliberately. He took the letter. His eyes locked onto the handwriting. Abby saw the exact moment the air left his lungs. His broad shoulders slumped. His hands, usually so steady, began to tremble, a violent, uncontrollable shake. He didn't open it. He just stared at the name. E. Reed. His knees gave out. Not a fall, but a slow collapse. He sat down hard on the chopping block. He pulled the letter to his chest. He buried his face in his large hands. He didn't cry, not out loud, but his breathing was jagged, broken. Abby didn't leave. She didn't mount up and ride away. She walked over to the chopping block. She sat down on the dirt right beside him, close enough that their coats brushed. But she didn't touch him. She just sat there in the fading light. They sat like that for 20 minutes. The sun dipped below the foothills. The air turned cool. Finally, Nathaniel took a shuddering breath. He ran a hand over his face. He looked at the envelope. Again, he slid his thumb under the flap, broke the old wax seal. He pulled out 2 sheets of paper. He read them in silence. As he read, the tension in his jaw slowly began to ease. The deep lines around his eyes softened. When he finished, he folded the letter. He placed it carefully on his knee. He looked at Abby. His eyes were red but clear. "She wrote this 2 weeks before the typhoid took her," Nathaniel said. His voice was a whisper. "I was working at the hospital, working day and night, trying to save people I couldn't save. I felt so guilty. Guilty that I couldn't fix her. Guilty that I survived the war when so many didn't." He tapped the folded paper. "I thought she resented me for the long hours, for the nightmares I brought home from the war. But she didn't." Abby looked at the letter. "What did she say?" Nathaniel looked up at the darkening sky. "She told me to stop punishing myself," he said. "She told me to let the dead bury the dead. She asked me to live a full life, not just wait around to die." Abby turned to face him fully. This was a truth they both needed to hear. She spoke clearly, her voice steady and deliberate in the quiet evening. "That is what true love actually looks like, Nathaniel," Abby said. "Love isn't a debt we have to pay back by suffering. True love is liberation. It isn't possession. Eleanor didn't want your guilt. She wanted your freedom. If we truly care for someone, we don't demand they halt their lives just because ours is ending. We demand they keep going. Healing from grief doesn't mean you love the dead any less. It means you respect their final wish for you to find joy again. She gave you permission to live. You have a moral obligation to take it." Nathaniel listened. He absorbed every word. He looked down at the letter. Then he looked at Abby. "Liberation," he repeated softly. He let the words settle into the cool evening air. He stood up. He reached down and offered Abby his hand. She looked at his scarred, calloused palm. She reached up and took it. He pulled her to her feet. "Thank you, Abby," he said. "Not just for the letter, for the ride, for sitting in the dirt, for the truth." "You're welcome, Nathaniel," she said. She walked back to Copper, swung into the saddle. As she rode away into the twilight, She looked back. Nathaniel was still standing by the chopping block. But for the first time in a long time, he wasn't standing in the shadows. July in Wyoming is a furnace. The sun doesn't just shine. It beats down. It bakes the dirt until it cracks like old porcelain. The prairie grass turns yellow, then brown, then it just turns to dust. Abby rode through the heat haze. The air shimmered over the trail. It made the distant foothills look like they were melting. Copper-S neck was lathered in thick white sweat. Flies buzzed around his ears. He flicked his tail, but he kept moving. He was a good horse. He knew the job. Abby pulled her hat down low. The brim cast a sharp shadow over her eyes. Her shirt clung to her back. Her lips were cracked. She took a sip from her canteen. The water was hot. It tasted like tin and old leather. She swallowed it anyway. The route was different in the summer. No blizzards, no frozen fingers. But the heat had its own teeth. It drained you. It made you heavy. She made her stops, dropped letters into some unbaked wooden boxes, nodded at farmers standing in dry fields. Nobody talked much. It was too hot for words. By the time she reached the end of the line, it was late afternoon. The shadows were getting long. The heat was finally breaking. Just a little. The reed cabin sat quiet against the trees, but it wasn't locked up tight anymore. The heavy oak door was propped open with a river stone. Nathaniel was sitting on the porch. He was in his shirt sleeves, suspenders down. He was whittling a piece of pine with a pocket knife. Long, slow strokes. Curls of wood fell to the porch boards. A tin cup sat on the railing. Condensation beaded on the outside. Water, fresh from the deep well, kept cool in the shade. Abby rode up. She slid down from the saddle. Her boots hit the dust with a soft thud. Her legs were stiff from the long ride. She looped copper-S reins over the hitching post. She didn't say hello. She just walked up the wooden steps. She picked up the tin cup, drank it down in 3 long swallows. The water was freezing cold. It hurt her teeth. It was the best thing she had ever tasted. "Obliged," she said. She set the cup down. Nathaniel didn't stop whittling. He just nodded. "Hot one today, like breathing in an oven," Abby said. She sat down on the top step. She leaned her back against the wooden post. She stretched her legs out. This was their new routine. She didn't ride away immediately anymore. She stayed. For 10 minutes. Sometimes 20. They didn't always talk. Sometimes they just sat. 2 tired people, listening to the wind in the pines. But today, the heat seemed to have loosened something. Nathaniel stopped his knife. He looked down at the piece of wood. It wasn't anything specific. Just a smooth, carved stick. "Chickamauga," he said. The word dropped into the quiet air like a stone in a pond. Abby didn't move. She just looked at the back of his head. "September 1863, Nathaniel continued. His voice was low, monotone, like he was reading from a ledger. It was hot then, too. Not dry heat like this. Wet heat. The kind that sticks to your skin and makes it hard to breathe." He folded the pocket knife with a sharp click. He slid it into his pocket. "I was a surgeon for the Union, 14th Army Corps. We set up a field hospital near Snodgrass Hill. Just a couple of canvas tents, some wooden tables. Nothing clean, nothing sterile. The fighting started, and it didn't stop." He turned his head. He looked out at the valley, but Abby knew he wasn't seeing the Wyoming prairie. He was seeing Georgia. "They brought them in by the dozens," he said. "Then the hundreds. Boys in blue, boys in gray. It didn't matter. They all bled the exact same color. They all screamed for their mothers. I ran out of morphine on the 2nd day. I ran out of chloroform on the 3rd. His hands were resting on his knees. The scarred knuckles were white. "That is when the real nightmare started," he said. "The triage. sorting the living from the dead, and deciding who got to be which. I had to walk down rows of bleeding men. I had to look at a boy of 19, see a gut wound, and know I couldn't save him. Not without supplies. Not with the 10 other men waiting who had a better chance. Nathaniel closed his eyes. The lines on his face deepened. I had to walk past the dying. I had to ignore their hands grabbing at my coat. I had to tell the orderlies to put them in the corner, to let them pass, because I had to spend my time sawing off the shattered leg of a man I might actually keep alive. I played God, Abby. I chose who breathed and who went into the dirt. He opened his eyes. He finally looked at her. And the terrible part isn't that I made those choices. The terrible part is that I survived, and they didn't. I came back. I married Eleanor. I had a life. And every time I closed my eyes, I saw the faces of the boys I left in the corner of that bloody tent. Abby sat completely still. The silence stretched out between them. Heavy, real. She didn't offer him pity. Pity was cheap. Pity was an insult to a man holding that kind of weight. Instead, she offered him the truth of her own ghosts. Samuel didn't die on a battlefield, Abby said. Her voice was steady. He died in our bed, under a quilt my mother made. She looked down at her dusty boots. When he got sick, he just got quiet. He stopped looking me in the eye. I thought he's just scared. He was trying to be brave, but he wasn't. He was hiding. She felt the old anger flare up. But it wasn't a wildfire anymore. It was just a steady, burning ember. He mortgaged the farm to pay for treatments he knew wouldn't work. He went to you. He heard the truth. And then he came home and lied to my face. Every single day for 6 months. Abby looked up. She looked right into Nathaniel S. eyes. He stole my chance to say goodbye properly. He stole my chance to brace myself. He left me with $340 in debt and a farm the bank was ready to swallow whole. He didn't just die, Nate. He abandoned me. He left me holding the bag, and I hated him for it. God help me. I hated him while I buried him. Nathaniel held her gaze. He understood. He didn't judge her. He knew what betrayal felt like. You still hate him, Nathaniel said quietly. I did, Abby said, for a long time. It kept me warm this past winter. Hate is good for that. It burns hot, but it burns you out. Abby shifted on the step. She turned her body toward him. The air was perfectly still. No wind. Just the two of them sitting with the wreckage of their pasts. She knew what she had to say next. It wasn't just a thought. She needed him to hear it. Clearly, without any confusion. Listen to me, Nathaniel, Abby said. Her tone shifted. It was firm, instructing. We both carry the dead around on our backs. You carry the soldiers. I carry Samuel. But let me tell you a fundamental truth about human healing. I want you to hear these words clearly. She paused, making sure he was listening. He was. Forgiveness isn't about erasing a dead man's mistakes. It is not in pardon for bad behavior. It does not mean that what Samuel did was right, or what happened in that medical tent was fair. She pointed a finger at him, then back at her own chest. Forgiveness is a permit for the living to finally breathe again. That is its only true purpose. It is a tool for the survivor. Holding on to rage and guilt does nothing to change the past. It only destroys the present. I am forgiving Samuel, not for his sake, because he is gone. I am forgiving him because I deserve peace. And you need to forgive yourself, Nathaniel. Not because you didn't make terrible choices in that war, but because you are still alive and you deserve to live without being punished for surviving. Nathaniel sat frozen. The words hit him, not like a bullet, like a sudden, deep breath of clean air after a lifetime of smoke. He looked at her hands, the calluses, the dirt under her fingernails. The hands of a woman who was fighting for her own life. A permit for the living, he repeated. The words felt strange in his mouth, but they felt right. Exactly, Abby said. She leaned back against the post. The heavy, suffocating weight that had been pressing down on the porch all afternoon seemed to lift. The air felt cooler. The shadows stretched longer across the yard. Nathaniel reached down beside his chair. He picked up the piece of pine he had been whittling. He turned it over in his large hands. Then he stood up. He didn't walk into the cabin. He walked down the steps. He walked over to Copper. The big roan snorted. Nathaniel ran a hand down the horse neck, calming him. Then Nathaniel moved to the saddle. He looked at the leather cinch strap. "This billet is frayed," Nathaniel said. His voice was back to normal. The gravel was still there, but the despair was gone. "It's going to snap on you in a week, maybe less. If you're on a steep grade when it goes, you'll break your neck." Abby stood up. She walked down the steps. He was at the step right. The leather was cracked and worn thin. "I'll have the saddler in Colton look at it on Thursday," she said. "No," Nathaniel said. He walked past her, up the steps, into the cabin. He came out a minute later. He was carrying a thick strip of cured oiled leather, a sharp awl, a heavy needle, and waxed thread. He walked back to the horse. He didn't ask for permission to fix the saddle, but he also didn't take the saddle off the horse and claim it as his own job. He stood next to her. "Hold the buckle steady," he said. Abby looked at him. She reached out. She gripped the heavy brass buckle. Nathaniel slid the awl through the tough new leather. He pushed the needle through. He pulled the waxed thread tight. His scarred hands were incredibly precise, incredibly steady. They stood there together, shoulder to shoulder in the fading light. He wasn't trying to take over her route. He wasn't telling her she couldn't ride. He wasn't trying to protect her by keeping her inside. He was fixing her gear so she could keep riding. It was an act of profound care, completely stripped of control. "Pull the thread on your side," he murmured. Abby pulled the thread taut. The knot locked into place. "Good," he said. They worked in silence, just the sound of leather creaking, the thread pulling tight, the occasional snort from the horse. The summer heat finally broke entirely. A cool breeze rolled down from the Bitterroot Mountains. It swept across the porch. It rustled the pine needles. Abby watched his hands work. The scars didn't look ugly anymore. They just looked like proof. Proof that a person could be broken and put back together and still have steady hands. When he tied off the final knot, the straps was stronger than it had been when it was new. Nathaniel stepped back. He wiped the awl on his trousers. "That will hold," he said. "Thank you," Abby said, and she meant it, for more than just the leather. She swung up into the saddle. The new strap held firm. She looked down at Nathaniel. He was looking up at her. The shadows were deep around them, but she could see his face clearly. "I'll see you on Thursday, Nate," she said. It was the first time she'd called him that. Not Nathaniel, not Mr. Reed, just Nate. A small, genuine smile touched the corners of his mouth. "Ride safe, Abby," he said. She turned Copper around. She spurred him lightly. They headed back down the long dirt road toward Colton. For the first time since Samuel died, the trail ahead didn't look quite so empty. The debt in the tin box was still there. The miles were still long, but the anger was gone. She took a deep breath of the cool evening air. She was breathing again. And she knew, back at the cabin at the end of the line, Nate was starting to breathe again, too. August didn't just arrive in Colton County. It invaded. The heat baked the prairie grass down to brittle yellow splinters. The creeks dried up, leaving behind cracked mud that looked like shattered pottery. Dust hung in the air from sunup to sundown. You chewed it with your supper. You breathed it in your sleep. Abby pulled her bandana up over her nose. Copper-S hooves kicked up small clouds of fine red dirt with every step. It was a Tuesday, mid-morning. The glare off the flatlands was blinding. She was an hour out of town. Approaching stop number 4, the Hendricks' place. Old man Hendricks had died years back. His widow, Sarah, lived there alone. She always waited on the porch on mail days. Not today. The porch was empty. Abby clicked her tongue, spurred Copper into a slow trot. Something felt wrong. The air was too still. She pulled up to the property line. She stopped. The wooden mailbox wasn't on its post. The post itself was snapped clean in half. Splintered pine pointed up at the harsh sun. The metal box lay in the dirt. It looked like it had been hit with a sledgehammer. Abby swung down from the saddle. She kept one hand near her hip, right where her old Colt revolver rested in its holster. She walked over to the wreck. Letters were scattered in the dust, trampled. Some were torn open. This wasn't the wind. The wind doesn't rip open envelopes and leave boot prints in the dirt. Big, heavy boots with a star-shaped spur mark on the heel. Abby knelt down. She gathered the letters, dusted them off. Her jaw set tight. She rode to the house and gave Sarah Hendricks her mail. The old woman was terrified. Said she heard horses in the night, men laughing, the sound of breaking wood. Abby didn't make promises she couldn't keep. She just nodded, tipped her hat, and rode on. It happened twice more that week. At the Miller crossing, someone had pulled the heavy iron pins out of the wooden bridge. If Copper hadn't balked at the edge, they both would have dropped 20 feet into a dry, rocky creek bed. On Friday, passing through Ridgeback Canyon, a rifle shot rang out. It wasn't aimed to kill. It hit the rock wall 10 feet above Abby's head, showered her hat with sharp granite chips. A warning. Someone was trying to scare her off the trail. Saturday morning, Abby rode into Colton. The town was busy. Cowboys in for the weekend. Wagons loading supplies. She tied Copper in front of the sheriff's office. She didn't bother dusting her coat. She walked right in. Deputy Amos Boone was sitting behind the big oak desk, boots crossed on the polished wood, a half-eaten apple in his hand. The sheriff was out of town. Again. That left Boone in charge. He didn't stand up when she walked in. "Mrs. Vance," Boone said. He took a bite of the apple, chewed loud. "To what do we owe the pleasure?" Abby walked right up to the desk. She placed 2 torn envelopes down on the wood. "Federal mail tampering," Abby said. Her voice was flat, hard. "Vandalism at the Hendricks place. Sabotage at the Miller crossing, and a warning shot fired at me in Ridgeback Canyon yesterday afternoon." Boone stopped chewing. He looked at the letters. Then he looked at her. He didn't look surprised. "Sounds like you're having a run of bad luck," Abby Boone said. He tossed the apple core into a brass spittoon. "I told you last winter, the trail ain't a safe place for a woman alone. Drifters move through. Kids get bored and break things. Drifters don't pry iron pins out of a load-bearing bridge, Amos. That takes crowbars and intent." Boone swung his boots off desk. He leaned forward. His badge caught the sunlight coming through the window. "Well, I'll ride out and take a look when I get a spare minute," Boone said. His tone made it clear that minute wasn't coming anytime soon. "But if the route is too dangerous, maybe you should think about handing that contract back to the county. For your own health." Abby stared at him. The message was loud and clear. "I'll keep riding," Abby said. She turned and walked out. She didn't go back to her horse, not immediately. She walked down the boardwalk, head down, thinking. Who benefited if she quit? Who gained if the contract broke? Josiah Blackwood. He wanted her land. He wanted the land along the route. If the mail stopped, the federal subsidies for the farmers stopped. They would dry up, and Blackwood would buy them out for pennies. Abby walked down the alleyway between the bank and the saloon. It was shaded, smelled like spilled beer and horse manure. She needed a quiet minute to put the pieces together. As she passed the open back window of the saloon, she heard a voice, smooth, like snake oil. Josiah Blackwood. Abby stopped dead in her tracks. She pressed her back against the rough wood of the saloon wall. She held her breath. "She was just in my office," came a second voice. "Amos Boone." Abby closed her eyes. The puzzle pieces slammed together. "Did she scare?" Blackwood asked. The clink of a glass. Pouring whiskey. "Not yet," Boone replied. "She's stubborn, like a mule. Handed me torn letters. I told her I'd look into it." Blackwood chuckled. "A low, mean sound. You don't get paid to look into it, Amos. You get paid to make her quit. The federal postal inspector is coming through Cheyenne at the end of the month to review the territorial routes. If she misses 3 deliveries, or if she loses a mail pouch, the contract is voided. Instantly. I know the law, Josiah." "Then do your job," Blackwood snapped. The amusement was gone. "I want her in default by the 15th. The bank will take her farm. Then we move on that crazy doctor at the end of the line. Reed. His land sits right on the water table. I want it." Abby's heart hammered against her ribs. They weren't just after her. They were after Nate. "Have Jebediah step it up," Blackwood commanded. "No more warning shots. Shoot the horse if you have to. Hurt her if she won't listen. Just make sure the mail doesn't reach the end of the line next week." Abby didn't wait to hear the rest. She moved silently down the alley, back out to the bright, glaring street. She untied Copper. She didn't ride home. She rode straight out of town. Her mind was racing. In the old days, 10 years ago, the answer would have been simple. Grab a rifle. Find Blackwood. End it in the street. But this wasn't the lawless frontier anymore. This was a territory trying to become a state. Violence didn't solve problems like Blackwood. It just made men like him look like victims. She needed a bigger gun. She got home. She didn't go to the lockbox where Samuel kept his Winchester rifle. Instead, she went to her small writing desk. She pulled out thick, heavy parchment. She uncorked a bottle of black ink. She picked up a steel-nibbed pen. She sat down, and she began to write, not to the local sheriff. The sheriff was owned by Blackwood. She wrote to the territorial governor in Cheyenne, and she wrote to the federal postal inspector in Denver. She documented everything, the dates, the times, the broken bridge pins, the shot fired in the canyon. She wrote down the exact conversation she overheard in the alley, word for word. She wrote for 3 hours. When she was finished, she had 5 pages of detailed, damning evidence of federal mail tampering, political corruption, and conspiracy to commit fraud. She sealed the envelope with hot red wax, stamped it tight. She didn't put it in her own mail pouch. Boone would check it. He would destroy it. That night, under the cover of a moonless sky, she rode 3 towns over, to the Union Pacific train depot. She paid the station master directly to put the letter on the midnight train eastbound to Denver. It was out of Boone's jurisdiction, out of Blackwood's reach. The trap was set, but the federal government moved slow. She had to survive the route until they arrived. The next morning, Abby rode the trail. She kept her colt loaded. She kept Copper at a fast trot. She didn't linger at the stops. Her eyes scanned every ridgeline, every shadow. She made it through Ridgeback Canyon without a shot fired, but the tension in her neck was tight as a piano wire. Late afternoon, she reached the end of the line. Nate was outside, working in his vegetable garden. pulling weeds in the fading heat. Abby pulled up. She dismounted fast. Nate took one look at her face and dropped his trowel. He wiped his hands on his pants and walked over. Fast. "What happened?" Nate asked. His voice was sharp, alert. "They're coming for the land." "Nate," Abby said. She didn't bother with hellos. She poured it all out. The sabotage, the warning shot, the conversation in the alley. Blackwood and Boone. They want my contract voided so the bank forecloses. And Blackwood told Boone he wants your land next. Because of your water rights. He told them to hurt me if I don't quit. Nate S.'s face went hard. The kind of hard that belonged on a battlefield. His jaw clenched. His eyes turned dark and dangerous. He didn't say a word. He just turned around. He marched toward the cabin. "Where are you going?" Abby called out. Inside," growled over his shoulder. "To get my repeating rifle. I'm riding into Colton. I'll drag Amos Boone out of that office by his neck. I'll put a gun to Blackwood's head and end this tonight." Abby ran after him. She caught his arm just as he reached the porch steps. She pulled hard, forcing him to stop and look at her. "No," Abby said. Her voice wasn't panicked. It was absolute iron. Nate looked down at her. The anger rolling off him was almost hot to the touch. "They shot at you, Abby. They are going to kill you for a piece of paper. I am not going to sit here and let a corrupt politician and a crooked badge hurt you." Abby didn't let go of his arm. She stepped right into his space. She looked up into his eyes. She needed him to understand. This was the most important thing she would ever tell him. "Put the gun down in your mind, Nate. Listen to me very carefully," Abby commanded. Her voice rang out clear in the quiet valley. True courage is not found in vigilante violence. Riding into town with a rifle doesn't make you a hero. It makes you an outlaw. It gives them exactly what they want. Blackwood. They will hang you. And the bank will take my farm anyway. Violent is a failure of intellect. Nate S.'s jaw twitched. The law in Colton is broken, Abby. Boone is the law. Boone is a local deputy. Abby shot back. I bypassed him. I wrote a detailed affidavit and sent it straight to the federal postal inspector in Denver and the territorial governor. Tampering with the United States mail is a federal felony. I fought back with a pen, Nate. I used the system. She squeezed his arm, emphasizing every word. We do not fight corruption by becoming murderers. We fight it with intellect. We fight it with the law. We document, we report, and we hold them accountable in the light of day. A civilized society is built on the premise that right makes might, not the other way around. If we want to be treated like citizens with rights, we have to act like it. We stand our ground legally. That takes more bravery than pulling a trigger in the dark. Nate stared at her. The heavy, violent tension slowly began to drain out of his shoulders. His breathing steadied. He looked at this woman standing in front of him, covered in trail dust, a target on her back, yet entirely unbroken. Standing there, lecturing a combat veteran on the true nature of courage. He realized she was entirely right. If he rode into town and killed men, he would just be returning to the blood of Chickamauga. He would be losing his soul all over again. She had just saved him from himself. Nate finally let out a long breath. He lowered his head a fraction, a gesture of surrender and deep respect. "You wrote to the federal inspector," Nate said softly. "Sent it last night on the midnight train," Abby confirmed. She finally let go of his arm. "How long until they get here?" "A week. Maybe 10 days," Abby said. "We just have to hold the line until then. I have to finish the route next week without missing a stop. If I do that, the contract holds. Blackwood loses." Nate looked out at the long, empty trail leading back toward town. The shadows were growing thick. They won't make it easy, he said. I know, Abby said. She adjusted the belt around her waist. But I've ridden through blizzards. I can ride through Josiah Blackwood. Nate turned back to her. He didn't smile, but the darkness in his eyes was gone, replaced by a fierce, steady resolve. All right, Nate said. We use the law. But until the law arrives from Denver, you keep your eyes open. You hear me? I always do, Abby said. She turned and walked back to Copper. The battle lines were drawn, not with bullets, but with ink and time and sheer, stubborn willpower. Abby swung into the saddle. She rode away from the cabin. She didn't know that Blackwood had already given the order. The federal inspector was on his way, but Jebediah, the hired gun, was already waiting in the canyon. The real storm hadn't even started yet. October in Wyoming doesn't knock, it kicks the door in. The morning air wasn't just cold, it was brittle. You could feel it snap when you breathed. A hard, early freeze had laid a thick coat of white frost over everything. The prairie looked like it was made of broken glass. Abby tightened the cinch on Copper's saddle. Her breath had plumed in the dark barn. It was Thursday. 3 days since she mailed the letter to Denver. 3 days of waiting for the other shoe to drop. Josiah Blackwood was running out of time. The federal inspector would be in Cheyenne by the weekend. If Abby finished today en route, she made it to Friday. If she made it to Friday, her contract was locked solid. She patted Copper's thick neck. The horse blew hot air through his nostrils. One more long ride, old boy, Abby whispered. Just get us through today. She mounted up. The mail bags felt heavier than usual. Her old Colt revolver knocked against her thigh. It was fully loaded. She wasn't taking chances. She rode out of Colton just as the sun broke the horizon. The light was pale and thin. It didn't offer any heat. The first 10 stops were quiet. Dead quiet. Folks came out to their porches, took their mail, nodded, went back inside. The cold kept words brief. By noon, the sky started to change. The pale blue bruised into a nasty, churning gray. A storm was rolling down from the Bitterroot Mountains. Not snow, sleet. Freezing rain that coated the grass in ice. Abby pulled her collar up. She tucked her chin down. 14 stops down, 8 to go. The trail turned sharp to the west, straight into Ridgeback Canyon. It was a narrow cut through the red rock, steep walls on both sides. The trail followed a dry creek bed at the bottom.
It was a natural choke point.
The wind howled through the gap, sounding like a high-pitched whistle. Abby slowed Copper to a walk. She unclasped the leather strap over her holster. Her eyes scanned the ridgeline. Left. Nothing but jagged rock and scrub pine. The canyon was dark. The storm clouds blocked the sun. The only sound was the crunch of hooves on frozen gravel. She made it halfway through. She started to let her breath out. Then the canyon wall exploded. A sharp, deafening crack echoed raw rocks. Smoke puffed from a ledge 40 feet up. Abby didn't even hear the bullet. She just felt the impact. It hit her left shoulder like a swing from a blacksmith's hammer. The force violently jerked her backward. Copper screamed. The horse reared up, terrified by the gunshot and the sudden shift in weight. Abby lost her left stirrup. She was falling. She grabbed the saddle horn with her right hand. Her knuckles turned white. She squeezed her knees tight against the horse's ribs. She fought gravity and won. She slammed back down into the saddle. Another shot rang out. The bullet bit into the dirt right next to Copper's front hooves. Go! Abby screamed. She spurred the big roan hard. Copper didn't need to be told twice. He bolted. They tore down the canyon, hooves kicking up a storm of frozen dirt and rock. Abby leaned low over the horse's neck, making herself small. A third shot echoed. It missed entirely, whining harmlessly off the canyon wall. They burst out of the canyon and hit the open prairie. Copper was running flat out, breathing hard, panicked. Abby let him run for a full mile, putting distance between them and the rifleman. When she was sure nobody was chasing them, she pulled back on the reins, slowing the horse to a rough trot, then a walk. She finally sat up straight. A wave of dizzy nausea hit her so hard she almost threw up. She looked down at her left arm. Her heavy wool coat was torn. The edges of the fabric were blackened from gunpowder, and the wool was soaking wet. A dark, shiny crimson stain was spreading fast down her sleeve. She reached over with her right hand. She pressed her fingers against the tear. Pain shot through her body like a lightning bolt. She gasped. Her vision swam, dissolving into static. It was a graze. The bullet hadn't hit the bone. It had plowed a deep, bloody furrow straight through the muscle of her upper arm. The bleeding was bad, but the cold was worse. The freezing sleet started to fall, mixing with the hot blood. She had to make a choice. Right then, Colton's was 5 miles behind her. The town doctor was there. Warmth was there. But Amos Boone was there, too. If she turned back, she didn't finish the route. The mail stayed in the bags. She would default on the contract. Blackwood would win. She would lose the farm, and Nate would be next. Abby looked at her bloody hand. She wiped it on her trousers. No, she said aloud. The wind snatched the word away. She gripped the reins. She turned Copper's head toward the mountains, toward the end of the line. Stop 15. The freezing rain turned into a downpour. Abby couldn't use her left arm at all. It hung useless at her side. She had to steer, open the canvas bags, and drop the letters all with one hand. Stop 16. She almost fell off the horse, reaching for a mailbox. Her head was swimming. The blood loss was taking its toll. The cold was seeping into her chest. Stop 18. The world started to lose its color. Everything turned into shades of gray. The pain in her shoulder throbbed with every beat of her heart. She kept her eyes fixed on Copper S. ears. Just keep the ears moving forward. That was the only goal. Stop 20. 2 miles left. The sleet freezing into her coat. She was encased in a thin layer of ice. Her lips were blue. She was shivering so violently she could barely stay in the saddle. Every instinct in her body screamed at her to lay down. Just slide off the horse, curl up in the brush, go to sleep. It would be so easy, so warm. She bit her own lip. Hard. The sharp pain cleared her head for a second. The taste of copper flooded her mouth. Don't quit, she muttered. Her voice was a broken rasp. Don't you dare quit. Stop 21. She pushed a bundle of letters into a tin box. She missed the box on the first try. The letters fell in the mud. She couldn't reach down to get them. She just left them there. One stop left. The final stretch. The road leading up to the Reed property. The trees offered a little cover from the wind, but the darkness was closing in. It was only mid-afternoon, but the storm made it look like midnight. Through the driving sleet, she saw it, the dark outline of the cabin. Abby's heart gave a weak, fluttering beat. She had made it. She had beaten Blackwood. She had beaten the canyon. Copper trudged up the slight incline. The horse was completely spent. They reached the front of the cabin. Abby pulled back on the reins. Copper stopped. She tried to take her right boot out of the stirrup. Her leg wouldn't move. The muscle was cramped tight, frozen solid. She tried to shift her weight, to slide down gracefully. She couldn't. Her body just gave out. The last ounce of willpower evaporated. The world spun violently. Abby slipped. She fell sideways off the tall horse. She hit the frozen ground hard. She landed on her bad shoulder. A scream tore itself from her throat, raw and agonizing. She lay there in the mud and the ice. Looking up at the dark porch, the mail pouch was still slung across her chest. Before the echo of her scream even faded, the heavy oak door of the cabin violently flew open. It didn't just open. It was thrown back so hard it banged against the outer wall. Warm, yellow lamplight poured out onto the snow. A shadow moved through the light. Fast. Nathaniel was there. He didn't have his coat on. His sleeves were rolled up. His hands were bare. He had been waiting right on the other side of the wood. He vaulted over the porch railing. He hit the ground running. He dropped to his knees beside her in the freezing mud. "Abby," he said. His voice was a harsh, urgent bark. He didn't ask if she was okay. He saw the blood. He saw the ice. He slipped one strong arm under her knees. He slid the other behind her back, carefully avoiding the torn shoulder. He lifted her. He was strong. He carried her up the stairs like she weighed nothing at all. He kicked the door shut behind them, sealing out the storm. The heat of the cabin hit Abby like a physical blow. The iron stove in the corner was roaring. The room was blindingly bright. Nate laid her down gently on the sturdy kitchen table. He didn't waste a single second. He grabbed a pair of heavy shears from a wooden tray. "I'm cutting the coat," he said. It wasn't a question. He sheared through the thick, bloody wool. He peeled the fabric away. He cut through her shirt, exposing the wound. Abby groaned. The sudden warmth was making the pain flare up 10 times worse. Nate turned to the stove. He grabbed a kettle of boiling water. He poured it into a tin basin. He dropped clean white rags into the steaming water. He brought the basin to the table. "This is going to burn," Nate said, looking her in the eyes. He pressed the scalding, hot, wet rag directly into the bullet wound. Abby arched her back. She clamped her teeth together so hard she thought they would shatter. She grabbed the edge of the table with her right hand. Nate held the rag steady. His hands were covered in her blood, but they didn't shake, not a millimeter. He was completely in his element. The surgeon from Chickamauga was back. He cleaned the dirt. He cleaned the gunpowder. He didn't offer her a drink. He poured it straight over the raw muscle. Abby squeezed her eyes shut. Tears leaked out of the corners. Then came the needle. Nate worked fast, precise. Every stitch was perfectly placed to pull the torn muscle back together. He tied off the heavy silk thread. He wrapped her shoulder tight in clean white linen bandages, binding her arm to her chest to keep it immobile. When he was done, he stepped back. He dropped the bloody needle into the basin. He leaned his hands on the edge of the table. He was breathing heavily. Sweat beaded on his forehead. Abby opened her eyes. The room was spinning a little slower now. The sharp, blinding pain had settled into a deep, heavy throb. She looked up at it. "Nate, you were at the door," Abby whispered. Her throat was bone dry. Nate grabbed a clean cup. He filled it with water from a pitcher. He slipped a hand behind her neck, lifting her head gently so she could drink. She swallowed greedily. Nate set the cup down. He pulled up a wooden chair and sat down right next to the table. He looked at her. His eyes were dark, burning with an intensity she had never seen before. "I heard the gunshot, Abby," Nate said. His voice was remarkably steady, but thick with emotion. "I heard it echo down the canyon 3 hours ago." Abby frowned. Confusion fought through the haze of pain. 3 hours, Abby rasped. "You knew I was shot 3 hours ago? Why didn't you ride out? Why didn't you come find me on the trail?" Nate leaned forward. He rested his forearms on his knees. He looked directly into her eyes. He wanted her to hear every single word clearly. "Because I trust your strength more than I entertain my own fear," Nate said. His voice was absolute, unshakable. He paused, letting the silence hold the weight of his words. True respect for a woman means trusting her capability, even when she is in terrible danger. It means having the discipline to let her finish her own fight. I stood at that door for 3 hours, bleeding inside, wanting nothing more than to saddle my horse and kill whoever hurt you. But I knew why you were riding. I knew about the contract. I knew that if I rode out there, grabbed your reins, and brought you back here to rescue you, the mail wouldn't get delivered. You would have defaulted. Everything you fought for would be gone. Abby stared at him, her breathing slowed. I knew your pride and your sense of duty wouldn't let you fall anywhere but at the very end of the line. Nate continued, his tone turning fiercely educational. If I had ridden out there, I would have been declaring that you were too weak to finish what you started. I would have been acting like a savior instead of a partner. A man who truly values a woman does not rob her of her own victories, no matter how much it terrifies him. Equality isn't just about sharing the good times. It is about respecting a woman's right to suffer, to endure, and to conquer her own battles without a man stepping in to take the reins. Abby lay quiet on the table. The throbbing in her shoulder was fierce, but a different kind of warmth was spreading through her chest. Every other man in Colton would have told her she was a fool. Every other man would have tried to save her, forcing her to fail the contract in the name of safety. Nate didn't. He suffered through 3 hours of terrifying waiting, just so she could cross the finish line under her own power. He gave her the dignity of her own endurance. Abby slowly reached out with her good right hand. She found his hand resting on his knee. His knuckles were white. She rested her fingers over his scars. The bags, Abby whispered. Are they? Nate looked down at her hand. He turned his palm up and laced his fingers through hers. A firm, grounding grip. I brought them inside, Nate said softly. The mail is delivered, Abby. The route is finished. You won. Abby closed her eyes. A long, shuddering sigh escaped her lips. The storm raged outside, battering the thick log walls of the cabin. The wind screamed through the pine. But inside the cabin, the war was over. She was safe. She was victorious. And for the first time in a very long time, she wasn't fighting alone. 3 days passed. The fever broke on the second night. By the third morning, the blinding pain in Abby's shoulder had dulled to a deep, heavy ache. She sat at Nate's kitchen table. Her left arm was bound tight to her chest in clean white linen. The cabin was quiet. The stove crackled. It smelled like fresh coffee and wood smoke. Nate was outside, chopping firewood. The steady thwack of the axe echoed through the pines. Abby stood up. Her legs were shaky, but they held. She needed to move. Sitting still made her feel like a trapped animal. She walked over to the small bookshelf near the window. Nate's medical books were there, thick, heavy volumes. Beside them sat a small leather-bound journal. It was open. Abby didn't mean to pry, but she saw her own name, written in Nate, sharp, precise handwriting. She stepped closer. She looked down at the pages. It wasn't a diary. It was a logbook. Tuesday, August 14, Route 14. Departed Colton, 6 a.m. Maintained 3-mile distance. No incidents. Friday, August 17. Ridgeback Canyon. Shot fired. Investigated canyon rim. Found spent casing. Vance unharmed. Maintained distance. Abby stopped breathing. She turned the page Monday. September 3. Trailed through Miller Crossing. Fixed broken bridge pins after she passed. Vance unaware. Her blood turned cold. Then it boiled. He had been there. The whole time. For months. Every time she rode out, thinking she was braving the trail alone, he had been a ghost at her back. Riding in her blind spots. Watching her. The front door opened. Nate walked in. He carried an armful of split pine logs. He kicked the door shut. He saw her standing by the bookshelf. He saw the open journal. He didn't drop the wood. He walked over to the stove, set the logs down in a neat pile. He dusted his hands on his trousers. He turned to face her. He didn't look guilty, but he was tired. "You followed me," Abby said. Her voice was barely a whisper, but it cut through the room like a knife. "Yes," Nate said, "for months." "Since the bridge pins," Nate answered. His voice was steady. "I couldn't prove Blackwood was behind it, but I knew someone was trying to kill you. I rode 3 miles back, enough to cover your trail, enough to make sure no one ambushed you from behind." Abby stepped away from the bookshelf, her good hand clenched into a fist. "You let me believe I was doing it alone. You let me believe I was fighting my own battles." "You were fighting them," Nate said. He took a step toward her. "I never interfered. I never delivered a letter. I never fought a man for you. I just watched your back. I stayed out of sight." "That isn't the point, Nathaniel," Abby shouted. The sudden volume hurt her chest, but she didn't care. She walked right up to him. She didn't let him retreat. "You lied by omission." Again, Abby said. Her eyes were burning, not with tears, with pure, unadulterated fury. She pointed her right finger at his chest. She needed him to understand this. She needed to make it so clear he could never forget it. "Listen to me," Abby said. Her voice was hard and exact. "Protection without consent is just another form of control. It doesn't matter if your intentions were good. It doesn't matter if you thought you were keeping me safe. By following me in secret, you took away my right to evaluate my own risks. You decided what was best for me without asking me. Partnership is built on transparency. When a man decides he knows what is best for a woman and acts behind her back, he isn't being her guardian. He is being her master. True equality means I have the right to know exactly what dangers I am facing and who is standing on the battlefield with me." Nate stood perfectly still. He absorbed the blow. He didn't flinch. He knew she was right. He had let his fear for her safety override his respect for her autonomy. "You are absolutely right," Nate said. His voice was low, filled with genuine regret. "I told myself I was honoring your independence by staying out of sight. But you were right. It was deceitful. Transparency is the only foundation for true equality. I was terrified of losing you, Abby, but I was wrong to let my fear strip you of your right to consent. I will never operate behind your back again." Abby looked at him. The anger in her chest flickered, then slowly began to recede. He didn't make excuses. He didn't tell her she was being ungrateful. He just owned his failure. Before she could answer, the sound of heavy hooves echoed outside. Not one horse, several. Nate stepped to the window. He pushed the curtain aside. "It's the law," Nate said. "Federal marshals, 3 of them." Abby walked to the door. She pulled it open. A tall man with a silver star pinned to his heavy wool coat swung down from a bay, gelding. 2 deputies flanked him, and tied to the back of a pack horse, looking bruised and sullen, was Deputy Amos Boone. He was in iron cuffs. The marshal touched the brim of his hat. "Mrs. Abigail Vance?" he asked. "I am," Abby said. She stepped out onto the porch. "I'm Federal Inspector Thomas Wade, out of Denver. We received your affidavit." The inspector looked at her bandaged shoulder. Then he looked at Nate, standing in the doorway. "Looks like we arrived a few days late," the inspector said grimly. "We picked up Josiah Blackwood in Colton 3 hours ago. He is in a holding cell waiting for a federal judge. Boone here rolled on him the second we put him in irons. They confessed to the tampering and to hiring a man named Jebediah to shoot you." Abby felt a massive suffocating weight lift off her chest. Jebediah is in custody, too, the inspector continued. We caught him drinking in Cheyenne, bragging about a job in Ridgeback Canyon. Your route is safe, Mrs. Vance. The territory will honor your contract in full. Blackwood's land grabs are officially null and void. Abby nodded slowly. Thank you, Inspector. Don't thank me, Wade said. He tipped his hat again. You used the pen to beat the sword, ma'am. That takes a rare kind of grit. Good day to you. The marshals mounted up. They turned their horses and rode back down the long trail toward Colton. Abby watched them go. The silence returned to the valley. The war was over. She had won. The farm was safe. The trail was safe. She turned back to face Nate. He was leaning against the doorframe, watching her, waiting. The contract is safe, Abby said. It is, Nate agreed. Abby walked back up the porch steps. She stood right in front of him. I have 2 months left on the debt, she said. I ride 3 days a week. Snow or shine? Nate nodded. If you want to ride this trail with me, Abby said, her voice dropping lower, softer, but unyielding. You ride beside me, where I can see you, as my equal. Never behind me in the shadows, never keeping secrets. You ride with me, or you don't ride at all. Nate looked into her eyes. The old broken doctor was gone. The man standing there was whole again. Beside you, Nate said. Always beside you. That is a promise. Abby smiled. It was a small smile, but it reached all the way to her eyes. Good, she said. Now, come back inside. The coffee is getting cold. November brought the real winter. The snow didn't just fall. It settled. It buried the prairie in a thick, heavy blanket of white. The pine trees bent under the weight. The rivers froze solid. It was a Tuesday morning. The air was sharp enough to cut glass. Abby walked out of the Colton livery stable. Her left arm was out of the sling. The shoulder still ached when the cold hit it deep, but it was strong enough to hold the reins. She swung a heavy saddle over Copper's back. She pulled the cinch tight. The new leather strap Nate had sewn held perfectly. She didn't mount up right away. She waited. A moment later, Nate walked out of the adjoining stall. He was leading a massive gray gelding. He threw his own saddle over the horse. He tightened his own cinch. He looked over at her. He didn't offer to lift her bags. He didn't offer to check her horse. He just gave a short nod. Ready? Nate asked. Ready, Abby said. They mounted up at the exact same time. They rode out of the barn together. The morning sun was bright, blindingly white against the fresh snow. They didn't ride in a single file. They rode side by side, knee to knee. Copper and the big gray walked in perfect rhythm. The town of Colton was waking up. Smoke drifted from the brick chimneys. They didn't head for the trail just yet. They turned down Main Street. They stopped in front of the Colton Bank. Abby swung down. Nate swung down beside her. He didn't follow her to the door. He stayed with the horses, standing guard. Not over her, but with her. Abby walked into the bank. The heat from the radiators was stifling. Mr. Abernathy, the bank manager, sat behind his polished mahogany desk. He was a small man, soft hands, nervous eyes. He had been a close friend of Josiah Blackwood. Now he just looked terrified of everyone. Abby walked up to his desk. She didn't sit down. She reached into her heavy wool coat. She pulled out a thick leather pouch. She untied the leather string. She turned the pouch upside down. Gold coins and crumpled greenbacks spilled across the polished wood. $340, Abby said. Her voice was flat, cold, plus 8% interest. Count it. Abernathy swallowed hard. He scrambled to stack the coins. He smoothed out the bills. His hands were shaking. It's all here, Mrs. Vance, Abernathy said quickly. He pulled a thick ledger from his drawer. He dipped his pen in ink. He drew a heavy black line through Samuel Vance's name. He reached into a lockbox. He pulled out a folded piece of heavy paper, the deed to her farm. He slid it across the desk. "The debt is settled," Abernathy said. He forced a tight, polite smile. "It is highly unusual for a widow to clear a debt of this size on her own. You are quite the novelty, Mrs. Vance." Abby picked up the deed. She folded it carefully. She slipped it into her inside pocket right over her heart. She looked down at the banker. She didn't smile back. "Let me educate you on something, Mr. Abernathy," Abby said. Her voice carried through the quiet bank. The tellers stopped counting. Everyone listened. A woman paying her own debts is not a novelty. It is a fundamental economic right. For too long, the law and men like you have treated women as financial dependents, as liabilities. But economic equality is the cornerstone of all human freedom. When a woman has the right to earn her own wage, hold her own deed, and clear her own name, she is no longer property. She is a citizen. I didn't pay this debt to impress you. I paid it to prove that my labor has exact, equal value to a man's labor. Do not ever call a woman's financial independence a novelty again. Abernathy's face flushed bright red. He dropped his gaze to the desk. "Yes, ma'am," he mumbled. Abby turned on her heel. She walked out of the bank. Her boots rang out on the hardwood floor. Loud, proud. She pushed the glass doors open and stepped out into the freezing winter air. Nate was waiting. He saw the look on her face. He saw the way she stood. Taller, lighter. The invisible chain that had been wrapped around her neck for 3 years was finally broken. "It's done?" Nate asked. "It's done," Abby said. "The land is mine. Free and clear." Nate smiled. A real, wide smile that touched his eyes and erased the years of grief from his face. "Congratulations, Abby." "Thank you." She walked over to Copper. She swung up into the saddle. The movement was fluid, easy. Nate mounted his gray. They turned their horses toward the edge of town. Toward the open prairie, the trail was waiting. 67 miles. 22 stops. But it wasn't a punishment anymore. It wasn't a desperate run for survival. It was just a job, a good job, a job she chose to do. They rode past the last buildings of Colton. The vast, snow-covered plains opened up before them, endless and wild. The wind picked up. It bit at their cheeks. It stung their eyes. Abby pulled her scarf up. Nate pulled his hat down. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The silence between them was no longer heavy with secrets or anger. It was filled with a deep, unbreakable respect. Copper picked up his pace. Gray matched him stride for stride. They rode into the store, side by side, equals in the snow. And for the first time in her life, Abigail Vance knew that no matter how hard the wind blew, she would never have to weather the storm alone again. Our channel shares dramatic and heartfelt Western stories about cowboys. Frontier love, family bonds, motherly devotion, compassion, mercy, and the deep kindness that connects people in difficult times. If you value stories with heart and meaning, please like, comment, share, and subscribe to join us for the next Western journey. The narrative presented here is fictional and created for artistic expression. Names, characters, and incidents are either invented or used in a fictitious manner. Any resemblance to actual persons or events is unintended and should not be considered factual or deliberate.
In the end, Abby Vance's story is not only a Western tale about a woman riding through snow, dust, danger, and lonely miles. It is a story about dignity. It reminds us that true courage is not always found in a gunfight, a loud speech, or a heroic rescue. Sometimes courage is simply getting back in the saddle when your body is tired, your heart is broken, and the world keeps telling you to quit. Abby teaches us that a person's worth is not decided by gender, grief, poverty, or the cruelty of others. Her strength comes from responsibility, compassion, and the belief that even in the harshest storm, human decency still matters. This story also shows us what real love should look like. Love is not control. Love is not hiding the truth to protect someone. Love is not standing in the shadows and making choices for another person. True love stands beside us, honestly and openly. It respects our freedom, our pain, our decisions, and our right to fight our own battles. Nathaniel's journey reminds us that even good intentions can cause harm if they take away another person's voice. But it also reminds us that people can change when they are brave enough to admit their mistakes, ask forgiveness, and learn how to love with respect instead of fear. The deeper meaning of Abby and Nathaniel's journey is that healing does not come from forgetting the past. It comes from facing it with truth. Abby had to face betrayal, debt, and anger. Nathaniel had to face guilt, war, and grief. Neither of them could erase what happened, but both of them learned that forgiveness is not a gift for the dead. It is freedom for the living. Forgiveness does not mean that the pain was acceptable. It means we refuse to let pain own the rest of our lives. It means we choose to breathe again, to trust again, and to walk forward even with scars. This story gives us a powerful lesson about justice as well. Abby did not defeat corruption by becoming cruel. She did not let hatred turn her into the same kind of person she was fighting. Instead, she used truth, patience, courage, and the law. She proved that strength is not only in the hand that pulls a trigger, but also in the hand that writes the truth and refuses to be silenced. Her victory reminds us that doing the right thing may be slow, painful, and dangerous, but it is still worth doing, most of all. This story leaves us with a simple but lasting message. In a hard world, compassion is never weakness. Respect is never wasted. Kindness can be as powerful as courage. And the people who help us heal are not always the ones who carry us away from the storm, but the ones who walk beside us until we find the strength to keep going. Our channel is dedicated to heartfelt Western stories about cowboys, frontier love, motherly devotion, human kindness, compassion, sacrifice, and the deep bonds that connect people in the most difficult times. If this story touched your heart, please give it a like. Share your thoughts in the comments. Share it with someone who loves meaningful Western tales. And subscribe to the channel so we can meet again on the next journey across the frontier.